Hello, welcome back to the spin-off channel Tales for Bookeemonsters. My main channel is Bookeemonsters, but we are doing a copyrighted bedtime read-aloud cozy mystery for Advent called Christmas at Glitter Peak Lodge. So we just wanted that little extra layer of protection from Bookeemonsters. So tonight, being December 18th, we are reading chapter 18. It's getting interesting, very interesting. So what we'll be doing here is I will step off the stage here. You'll just see the ambiance, which is a crackling fire, and I'll read the chapter, and then I'll say goodnight, and we'll be done. Cajun was just saying last night ended on an infuriating shocker. Yes. Things are getting interesting. More and more people are showing up at the lodge and being introduced as characters of interest. So, let's see what the 18th brings for us. Let me pop off. I just want to give you a heads up. We are having a huge windstorm. We haven't had any power issues, but if I lose power, that's why. If you hear some roaring in the background, that's why. All right. December 18. Ingrid lay in bed, cold and tired, with a seed of anticipation somewhere deep down beneath the ice. Vigard wasn't the only one who called her Ice Queen. People always had. When they talked behind her back, she knew that. No matter how much admiration she garnered as a result of her expeditions, she knew that a lot of people also thought of her as too disciplined, too controlled. Unnatural, she'd heard someone say once. And when it had all gone wrong, there'd been no shortage of schadenfreude. It was as if people had always sensed something inferior behind that perfect facade of hers. This iciness came up again with Preben yesterday. "You seem so cold, Ingrid," he said. "Why won't you talk to me?" The injustice in his questions still stung because he was the one who failed her and who'd made her fail herself. She'd needed to stay away from Preben because he was bad for her. He made her weak. It was her infatuation with Preben that had made her lose control, grow careless. And she'd been punished so terribly for that. She'd lost everything, Preben, climbing, and the child. She'd also lost a community, many friendships, and the involvement in the mountain areas she spent time in for so many years. And now Preben was here and wanted to make up for it. Was that even possible? She'd thought about his proposal all night. Preben was sitting alone at a table by the window. He stared out over the mountains, whose silhouettes were now emerging against the brightening sky. He had a bowl of oatmeal, a cup of coffee, and a glass of orange juice on the table in front of him, what he always ate for breakfast. After all these months, she now couldn't feel any resentment toward him, no matter how hard she tried. The conversation yesterday had calmed her a bit. That didn't mean everything was okay now. It never would be. But he'd made a proposal, and she was going to listen to what he had to say. Preben looked up as she walked over to him. "Hi, Ingrid." "Hi." She hesitated. He pointed at the chair across from him with his right hand. "Have a seat, if you want." She did as he said, concentrating on keeping her movement steady as she pulled out the chair and positioned herself across from the man who'd once been the center of her life and whom she now felt as if she barely knew. He took a sip of orange juice and dabbed at his mouth with a paper napkin before folding it and setting it down next to his plate. Maybe he was also a bit nervous, she thought. Maybe that's why he just turned up here instead of calling or sending an email about what was on his mind. "Thank you for taking the time to talk," he said. She had to smile a bit. "You haven't exactly given me any choice." Should we sit here or go somewhere else? It's nice here. Then the others will know you're safe too. I saw the looks I got from that friend of yours yesterday. He almost seemed like he was trying to be your bodyguard. My friend? Thor? Yeah, the blonde guy on his way out as I was coming. Broad-shouldered fellow. Did you find yourself a real-life farmer up here? Preben, stop right there. You can't show up here in the middle of farm country and start criticizing people for being farmers. I haven't criticized anyone, have I? I was only asking. She thought she caught a glimpse of the old jokester in his eyes. He went on, but you're right. That's not why I'm here. He brushed an imaginary crumb off the tablecloth before looking at her again. Then he leaned over and picked up a leather bag from the floor. He placed it in his lap, pulled out a plastic folder full of papers, and held it out across the table. See what you think about this. He handed her a sheet of paper with the heading BOW, the Berg Orlando Wexelson Foundation. Ingrid and Preben sat at the window table for a long time, even after the kitchen staff had finished cleaning up and the dining room slowly emptied following breakfast. Normally, Ingrid would never have just sat there this way while the staff worked around her. She also had 1,000 things to do. But right now, she was certain that this was the most important. Even when Nana Borghild stopped by the dining room and raised an eyebrow at her and Preben, Ingrid chose to stay seated instead of finding out what her grandmother wanted. God knows the two of them had plenty to talk about later. She could feel her voice wasn't quite steady when she spoke. This is all pretty overwhelming, Preben. I'm happy and surprised that you're suggesting this, and I'd like to contribute. I really would. She paused. But I still don't know how you and I would be able to work together after what happened. We haven't even talked about it. Preben looked at her again, serious now. No, we haven't talked about it, and I think it's about time. It's been 1.5 years, Ingrid. We're heading into the second Christmas since the accident, without having exchanged a single word. You just disappeared and left me behind to pick up the pieces. She looked at him. Was that how he remembered things? But what was I supposed to do, Preben? I had to leave. You had to leave? Yes, I was on the verge of a total breakdown. The avalanche and the fact that Giovanni was dead. She took a deep breath. Everything they wrote in the papers, all the criticism, that it was our fault. I understood why they thought so too. And all the speculation about the two of us. Preben took a sudden and inaudible breath. Ingrid, don't you think it was hard for me too? Giovanni was dead. The whole group had been put in danger. We had to stop our work. And then in the middle of all of this, you left the country without even saying goodbye. You didn't say anything. You didn't answer when I called or texted. I was furious with you, she said, for what happened, for the danger you put us in. What bothers me most is that you can't admit you made a mistake. You were pushing so hard so we could break the record. Even though we should have waited until conditions were safer, you should have known. The forecasts weren't good. We should have stayed at base camp. She felt hot and could hear she was raising her voice now. We almost died, Preben. We knew there was an avalanche risk. We shouldn't have gone out there that day, and definitely not when we had a less experienced climber like Giovanni with us. That decision cost him his life. I couldn't forgive you, and I couldn't forgive myself for letting you cloud my judgment like that. Preben's green eyes darkened. I assume you recall that you're the one who wanted Giovanni to join the expedition, but yes, it was a miscalculation to leave base camp that day. It was the biggest mistake I've ever made. I'm never going to forgive myself, nor do I expect anyone else to. The work I've started now is just as much an attempt at reconciliation with you as it is to make amends in some way. He sat quietly for a while. That avalanche cost us a lot, and the fact that it also cost me not just my relationship with you, but that you felt you had to break off contact completely, hate me, that's been difficult to handle. And what I'm doing now is trying to show you that I'm taking responsibility. She hesitated. How much should she tell him? Should she also share that he still didn't know about that fatal trip? About the child they lost? She knew what Vigard had said was true. She needed to tell Preben, but not now. She looked around the empty dining room. One day she would tell him, but this was neither the time nor the place. Still, she had to try to explain herself. I was devastated, Preben, and after the avalanche and the injuries and the shock of losing Giovanni, after all the media coverage, I couldn't keep going. Not with the work, not with you. I'm sorry. She felt a salty taste in her throat and dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. She suddenly realized that this was the first time she'd ever cried in front of Preben. They'd been together for years and shared so much: enthusiasm, joy, passion, wild ambitions, anger, obstinance, willpower, nerves on the way up a rock face and longing to get right back up there as soon as they were down. This urge that got them to plan the next adventure as soon as one was over. They'd shared all of these things, but grief, that was something they'd never shared until now. I know everything thinks I'm so cold, Ingrid said, but I felt like you were the one who was cold up there, Preben. And afterward, I guess I thought you couldn't understand how I felt, and I didn't really think you cared either. I felt like you were only calling because it would look bad not to. You stopped trying to contact me after a few weeks. I started over here after losing everything, and before I knew it, there you were on TV, on a reality show, like nothing had happened. Yes, after a while, I chose to keep going with my life, Preben said, and my climbing career. Even though you made a different choice, it was the right one for me. I know I'm privileged, Ingrid. I admit that both success and material rewards mean a lot to me, and I know it seems like I just get through most things unaffected, but I was affected. He looked out of the window for a moment. You know, Ingrid, I'm actually not completely devoid of emotions. I've missed you. He didn't meet her gaze now. Were his eyes shining a bit? What was she supposed to say? Had he actually missed her? She felt almost ashamed at how little she'd thought about how the accident must have affected Preben's life, too. She'd been so blinded by her own loss that she hadn't seen his. He looked at her in the eyes again. She felt something warm inside her. But no, she wasn't going back there. She straightened up and said nothing. Preben said, I'm happy that we're at least at the point where we can talk about it, Ingrid. I don't expect that things will go back to the way they were. Maybe it won't even be possible for us to be friends. But if we can at least stop being enemies, we'll have come a long way. Can we agree on that? Ingrid nodded. Okay. Good. He rubbed his hands together in a way she recognized from when he was pleased with a good business deal or reveling in a challenging wall that he would soon conquer. He looked around the now empty dining room. By the way, it's quite a place you have here. Really great. It's nice to see it again. A venerable old hotel, a tradition to carry on. Props to you for taking it on, Ingrid. I know you can do this. You can do this. Now she felt it again, the warmth, the inspiration, but also the fear. The same feeling she'd had before setting off on a climb. Ambition, anxiety, concentration, longing, the wild power of climbing in the face of the fear of falling, the almost incomprehensible and self-destructive urge to do what you're most afraid of. I'm actually not sure I can do it, she said. It's too hard. Now the tears were coming again. God damn it. But so be it. When others looked at Ingrid, they saw someone in complete control, someone who knew what she was doing. Control was necessary to be a good climber. Know the route, be willing to prepare, try again and again. But at the same time, you had to live with the awareness that control was an illusion. At any moment, your foothold could slip, the gear could fail, the belay could come loose. This was the terror and the fascination, the duality you had to live with. Only another climber could recognize and share those feelings. and not just any climber. Right now, it felt as though Preben Wexelson was the only person in the world who could really understand her. Too hard, Preben said, to run the hotel? I don't believe that. I know you. You might think it's too hard right now, but you said the same thing when we were training in Vastervik that one summer too. Preben's voice was warm, almost laughing. You spent days mastering only the first few feet there. At some point, it seemed completely impossible. You were so pissed. You even packed all your things and wanted to go back home, remember? She met his gaze, but looked away quickly. Yes, I remember. That wall was a bitch. Footholes the size of a dime. Crimps as thin as a credit card. But you didn't go home. You went back to the wall again and again. Failed again and again. But then one day, you didn't fail anymore. You got to the top. She smiled through her tears. And it wasn't long before I wanted to get started planning the next trip. Preben grinned. Yup. Then you were ready to go up to the crag in Flatanger where people spent years trying to send the most difficult routes. So what you're trying to say is that if I manage this, if I succeed in running the hotel, I'm going to start planning on opening another one, a much bigger hotel? He chuckled. No, I don't think you're going to open another hotel, at least not in Norway. That would just be doing the same thing all over again. When you've just climbed a mountain, you don't climb the same mountain again. You do something completely different. You take on the highest peak on another continent. Like us. He looked at her. The next thing you open will probably be the BOW Foundation offices in Nepal. If you can forgive me long enough to believe we can do this together, that is, he said. You and I, in honor of Brother Giovanni. I want to forgive you, she said. I'll work on it. But what about you? Can you forgive me? Preben looked at her a long time. I don't think I have much to forgive you for, he said. I'm just happy we've come as far as we have. Preben Wexelson, a voice said beside him. It's been a while. Yes, it has, Mrs. Berg, Preben replied with a smile as he stood up, his charm turned up to the max. It's so nice to finally see you again. Nana Borghild held out her hand and formally, but politely, greeted Preben, whom she had met only once before. It must have been 4 years since you and Ingrid were here, she said. Yes, that's right, Preben confirmed. It was only a short visit then, and who would have thought it would be so long until the next time? Nana Borghild had managed to convince Preben to stay for lunch. Not exactly a dream scenario, Ingrid thought as they sat down at the table, but it went better than she'd feared. Preben was working his charm, and Nana Borghild was falling for it too. They just finished eating when Aisha came into the dining room and leaned over Ingrid's chair. Sorry to disturb you, she said, but I can't find Hussein. He had a half day, so we came back an hour ago, but now I don't know where he's gotten off to. Oh gosh, Ingrid exclaimed. He hasn't gone out on his own again, has he? Again? Aisha asked, and Ingrid could have bitten her tongue off. I'll go check if his outerwear is gone, Aisha said. Let me just run upstairs. When she came back downstairs a few minutes later, her face was pale. He's taken his jacket and outdoor pants and winter boots. We have to go look for him, Ingrid decided, standing up abruptly. Preben, come with me. She had a bad feeling. He hadn't gone toward Heaven's Horn, had he? He'd been an eager climber from the very first time she saw him, and now she feared he was making good on what he'd said about summiting the mountain. We have to check outside first. Ingrid ran out the front door. It was snowing so hard that it was difficult to see the footprints, and footprints would be wiped out quickly. But there, was it? Yes, she was pretty sure it was the imprint of a child's winter boots that she saw going down the stairs. He's out there, she said when she came back in to put on warm clothes. The others had gathered at the reception desk. Nana, Aisha, search everywhere here in the hotel just in case. Preben and I will look for him outside. I should have given him a phone, Aisha said, her voice starting to shake. What about one of those smartwatches? Preben suggested. The kind you can call him on I mean, when we find him again? Thanks a lot for that, Ingrid thought, dragging Preben to the cloakroom and handing him a bag with ropes, harnesses, and a wool blanket. He got dressed quickly and took the necessary equipment: crampons, cams, helmets. If we haven't called or aren't back in 15 minutes, you need to call for help, she said to Nana Borghild. They had a long way to go, and it was getting dark. Snow pelted them in the face as Ingrid and Preben struggled forward against the wind. The footprints had ended just past the parking lot, but Ingrid had the terrible feeling that she knew exactly where they needed to look. She and Preben moved in silence. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and checked it with stiff fingers. No service. Nana had probably called the rescue team by now, but deep down, Ingrid knew that help wouldn't be able to get there in time. If Hussein was where she thought he was, it was urgent that they find him, fast. She stopped for a few seconds at Angelina Hill. Ingrid thought of all the times she'd stood there. As a child, she thought her mother and father had traveled up to heaven from here, and even as an adult, she continued drawing strength from this place. Now she was going to need all the strength she could get. Preben stopped in the flurry behind her, came a little closer, and put a hand on her shoulder. She turned and met his gaze. She wanted to smile, but couldn't manage it. She put her gloved hand over his. It was getting harder to walk now, but they struggled on, past the frozen Stigfossen, and up to the base of the steep wall on Heaven's Horn. She shielded her eyes with one hand and looked up, but there wasn't much visibility. The wind was howling around them, and snow stung her face. Do you really think the boy could have climbed up here alone in this weather and started climbing on his own? Preben asked. Maybe it's better if we wait here until the rescue team arrives. She shook her head. We have to check. If he's where I think he is, we don't have time to wait. Conditions are too bad for a helicopter to come now. But we can climb. Ingrid, I'll do it, Preben said firmly. She squinted up into the snow, following the rock with her eyes. If Hussein was here, how could he possibly have managed to get up? It looked as if some snow had recently collapsed nearby. There was probably a snow bridge that Hussein had crossed, and then it had collapsed behind him. In that case, he had no chance of getting back without any help. She knew that she now had to do what she hadn't dared to do for such a long time, what she thought she'd never be able to do again. She had to climb. Thanks, Preben. You're a great climber. But right now, on this particular wall, I honestly don't think anyone can climb it better than me. I need to lead in any case. They walked across the snow, and she carefully felt for where to put her weight so she wouldn't fall through. When they reached the wall, she took a few tentative steps up, pushing off. One more hold, then another. She stopped on the first small ledge only a few feet above where Preben was standing. She felt the coil of rope she had on her back and checked her gear. There wouldn't be many opportunities to place any protection now, but she might be able to use some of the cams, and she might also need the rope to pull Hussein up if he'd fallen into a crack. She shouted upward, Hussein! No response. Preben shouted too. His voice echoed up the rock and was louder than hers. Hussein! And then, there, she heard a faint sound, far, far above her, a child's voice. Help! It cried. Auntie Ingrid, you have to help me. The white dragon hissed at her, wanting to paralyze her, but she let it hiss. The only thing that mattered was grabbing the next hold. She couldn't think, only focus on where her fingers could find something to hold on to, where her foot could find purchase. She'd done this 1,000 times, but she thought she'd never do it again. Cold, snow, ice. It was pure madness to climb Heaven's Horn in the middle of the winter without proper equipment. She could die. Hussein could die. But he was definitely going to die if she didn't try. She couldn't be responsible for yet another life being lost. She pushed away her thoughts about the snow, about the cold, about what would happen if Hussein lost his balance and fell. She just thought about the next little crack she could jam her foot into, the next hole wide enough for her to get her fingers around it. Her body took over now. It remembered the details of the mountain. She threw herself over the next ledge and reached the plateau with aching fingers and a racing pulse. She must have heard his voice up here, but there was no Hussein to be seen. Could he have gotten even further up? No, that was impossible. She carefully made her way forward. It was hard to see where the edge was through the thick snowfall. One wrong step, and she'd end up on the scree far, far below. "Hussein!" she shouted. "Hussein, are you here?" No answer. "Hussein!" Was that a voice? Now she heard it again. The wind was doing its best to drown it out, but there it was. "Help!" Was he over the edge? She crawled on her hands and knees and looked down. And yes, there on a ledge just below, she saw a red jacket. "Hussein, thank God!" She leaned over and met his gaze. His eyes were like two tiny black dots in a face pinched with pain and cold. "Annie Ingrid, it hurts." "Give me your hand." She grabbed his wrist with her left hand while she took out the rope with her right. She had to get it under his arms and secure him before she lifted it so she didn't lose her grip, and she stopped the thought. This was a crucial moment. Now she really had to focus. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She was completely focused on Hussein. She tied the rope around him and made sure she had solid footing. She tensed all her muscles. "All right, Hussein, I have you now." As the Alpine rescue team made their way toward Heaven's Horn from the hotel, they met a woman with climbing equipment and a man carrying a bundle in a wool blanket. The bundle turned out to be a half-frozen little boy with an injured foot and wrist. He'd fallen off a ledge but miraculously seemed to have escaped without any major injuries, reported the online edition of the Dahlin Daily shortly afterward. Aisha and Nana Borghild met Ingrid and Preben in the foyer. Ingrid's hands were frozen, but otherwise she was warm, euphoric even. She'd never experienced such a rush of adrenaline before. Tears were streaming down Aisha's face when she saw Hussein in Preben's arms. "Thank you, Allah," she cried. "Thank goodness, Hussein. I thought you were dead." Dr. Wilkins examined Hussein up in the apartment. Apart from a sprained wrist, a sprained ankle, and some mild frostbite on his face and fingers, the boy would be fine, the doctor assured them. He prescribed a hot bath, lots of hot chocolate with whipped cream, and a Skype call to Jordan. "He told me he misses his dad so much he feels sick," Dr. Wilkins explained. That contributed to this crazy idea of his. He thought that maybe he could make some kind of connection with him if he just went to the highest mountaintop possible. And someone in his class had apparently challenged him and said he'd never make it. You should have a chat with the school and find out how he's really doing. But otherwise, I must say he has a unique talent for climbing, and he should be allowed to continue with that, though perhaps under more controlled conditions. "I can practice with him," Ingrid said. "Are you going to go climbing again?" Preben asked, grinning. "Yes, I sure am," she replied. "The cold never bothered me anyway." 4 was freezing. It would take a while for the heater to get the temperature in the car up to a tolerable level. He turned on the radio and drove slowly down the farm road. It was playing pan flute versions of Christmas songs. He shuddered. Just as he was about to change the channel, the familiar note signaling the news bulletin sounded. "Time for the 5 o'clock news. The government's offshore wind plans are being criticized by several parties." Well, offshore wind was something they didn't have here in Dahlin. He switched over to Radio Rock. The afternoon feeding was over, and Thor was planning to drive down to Lillehammer for some Christmas shopping. Not that it was going to be much, probably a wool scarf and hand cream for Mom and new gloves for Dad. Not the most imaginative, but his parents didn't expect anything too inventive. He'd sent money to his sister Greta in Bergen so she could buy presents for her kids from Uncle Thor. It had been quite a big sum considering his financial situation, and especially considering that Greta and her husband Magnus earned about 4 times more than he did. But given how little he saw of the children, a generous Christmas present was the least he could offer. His sister and her family sometimes came to visit during the summer, but they usually stayed at home in their big house for Christmas. They were visited by Magnus's family and always invited Thor and his parents too. But Thor had the farm to take care of, and his parents preferred to stay at home, so Thor celebrated with them. Sometimes Aunt Maja joined them as well, but she had to work this Christmas. He turned onto the main road and noticed he was stepping on the gas a little too hard. Maybe he was trying to push away what had been spinning around in his head since yesterday. Glitter Peak. He'd been up half the night thinking about what had happened between him and Ingrid, the happiness he'd felt in her apartment, to think that he'd finally been able to get so close to her. And then the come down. This guy who'd elbowed his way in. He knew who he was. Preben Wexelson. He'd seen him on TV. Arrogant. And Ingrid had practically shoved Thor out the door when Preben arrived. No, he wanted to think about something else. He thought about checking out some photography equipment since he'd already be in town. His camera was good, but you could never have too much equipment. The lens he wanted most was far too expensive, but he liked browsing in the photo shop and was glad such specialty stores still existed. He usually chatted a bit with the older man who worked there. He'd run the place since before the store was bought by a big chain and long before the phone took over as the camera most people used. Thor felt they had something in common. They were two people who'd been left behind in a way, people who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to modern life. Stores were open late in Lillehammer today, and the main shopping street was sure to be full of the holiday spirit. Music, Christmas lights between the buildings, the Salvation Army's Christmas tree, and a stall selling wreaths and another serving mulled wine, people with ice skates in hand, and children with anticipation shining in their eyes. He remembered what that had been like, looking forward to Christmas. Now he couldn't really say he looked forward to it all that much. He knew exactly what it was going to be like. Christmas choirs on TV at his parents' house, ribs and sauerkraut, Dad drinking exactly one glass of aquavit too many, so Mom got annoyed. The tragic little gift exchange, the predictable rounds of thank yous. Mom's kransekake. Well, that was actually a highlight, he had to admit that. Dad nodding off in the easy chair, Mom urging Thor to have another cup of coffee, until at some point he would say, just as he did every year, no thanks. Now he had to get home and go to bed so he could get ready for the morning rounds. He loved his parents, but they weren't exactly how he'd envisioned things turning out. When he and Sandra got married, he dreamed of a future with lots of children, lively parties, people coming and going, lots of hustle and bustle on the farm. That had never happened. Now it was just quiet. He did have the sheep, but still. It was already pitch black out. The days were so short now. The roads were fully drivable, but the plowing after the heavy snowfall earlier in the day had left large drifts along the road, especially at the edge of Dalen, where they were almost like walls in some places. He'd plowed thoroughly at home and at his parents', but when he came back from the hotel yesterday, he noticed something strange. A lot of car tracks. And they weren't from any of his own cars. The whole yard was full of them. It looked as if someone had been driving around and around there. What on earth was that about? He looked around when he got out of his car, wondering whether anyone was there. No cars. That was obvious, but could someone be inside the house? There were no strange footprints at the door, and no sign of anything out of the ordinary when he let himself in. Still, he felt a strong sense of unease that lingered long after he'd come inside. The first thing he'd done was to call his parents to check that everything was okay. His mother sounded surprised at the question. Yes, of course, Thor. Why? No reason, he said. I just wanted to check in. With the bad weather and all that. Anything you need over there? He couldn't say what he was really worried about. That is, what Hallgrim and his family might do if Thor kept digging around in matters that were none of his business. He thought the Dahlen family had been at the farm to send a message that they were watching him and to remind him who was in charge here in the village. The thought made him uneasy, and on top of everything else, this Wexelson fellow had shown up. Ingrid clearly hadn't been pleased to see him. Thor regretted that he'd let himself be pushed away so easily. He should have been there to keep watch over what was happening. Was Wexelson still there? What if he threatened or bothered Ingrid in some way? Thor couldn't just let that happen. He abruptly turned off the road and into a turnout by the old lumber yard. He'd changed his mind. Christmas shopping could wait. This was more urgent. He drove out onto the road again, this time in the opposite direction, toward Glitter Peak. It wouldn't hurt if he made the trip up there just to check. Ingrid had to know he was there for her if she needed him. The rescue team was given coffee and cookies as consolation for having come up for no reason, and Ingrid and Preben changed into dry clothes and sat down in the library. Preben gratefully accepted a glass of wine. He'd drive back down to Oslo tomorrow. He was sure that the representatives of the organization would understand why he had to postpone the meeting by a day. "You were right, Preben," Ingrid said, "about me climbing again. You've been scared before, but you always wanted to get back up there again," Preben pointed out. "When I had to do it to save Hussein, it was like the crisis went out over the fear. I didn't have time to stop to think or listen for avalanches. My body just propelled me up." Preben took another sip of wine. "Well, it's been quite a day, that's for sure. Never a dull moment with you, Ingrid." "I'm so grateful for everything you've done today, Preben," she said. "I felt like we were a team again out there." They raised their glasses to each other in a silent toast. Ingrid reached a hand across the table. Her fingers closed over Preben's, and she squeezed gently. He squeezed back. Of course, it was just then, as Preben and Ingrid sat hand in hand with the starry sky over Heaven's Horn as a backdrop, that Thor Cedar entered the library. He froze on the spot before abruptly turning on his heel and walking out of the room with quick steps. Ingrid stood up and ran after him. "Thor," she said as she caught up to him in the foyer. She put a hand on his arm. "Thor, it's not what you—" She stopped herself. Why did she have to explain herself to him? She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? But a voice inside her was shouting, "He's not going to forget this. Now you've ruined everything." Ruined what, though? She asked herself. What is there to ruin? She pulled her hand away. Thor was facing her, but he was completely stiff. There was no laughter in those blue eyes now. "I misunderstood," he said. His voice was hoarse. I just wanted to come up and see if everything was okay. But clearly it is. I'll just go back down. I should have realized I was only a backup." "No," she practically shouted. "Don't go." He looked at her skeptically. "Why not?" "Because it's not what you think." End of chapter 18. We will do chapter 19 tomorrow. Have a good night. God bless.